Hey everyone, welcome back to Botanic Haven. I'm so glad you're here with us today. For those of you who are new to the channel, this is your go-to place for everything about gardening, plant care, and creating those beautiful green spaces, both inside your home and outside in your yard. We're all about making gardening accessible, enjoyable, and honestly, a little bit easier than you might think. Today we're diving into something that I get asked about constantly, and it's a topic that honestly changed the way I think about gardening entirely. We're talking about how to establish a food plant that survives without watering or care. Now I know what you're thinking, it sounds almost too good to be true, right? Plants that feed you without all the fuss. But stick with me here because this is absolutely possible, and I'm going to walk you through exactly how to make it happen in your own garden. Let me start by sharing a quick story that really opened my eyes to this whole concept. A few years back, I met this woman named Daisy at a community garden event. She was in her 70s, still vibrant and full of energy, and she told me something that stuck with me. She said she'd been gardening her whole life, but in recent years her knees weren't what they used to be, and bending down to water and fuss over plants every day had become genuinely difficult, but she didn't want to give up her garden. So she started experimenting with what she called her lazy garden approach. She focused entirely on plants that could basically take care of themselves once they were established. When I visited her place a few months later, I was blown away. She had fig trees dropping fruit, asparagus coming up year after year, and herbs that were practically indestructible. Her garden was thriving, and she was spending maybe an hour a week just harvesting and enjoying it. That's when I realized that this approach wasn't just about being lazy. It was about being smart, working with nature instead of against it, and choosing the right plants for the right conditions. So let's talk about what this actually means in practical terms. When we say a food plant that survives without watering or care, we're really talking about perennial plants that are deeply adapted to their environment. These are plants that have evolved to handle whatever nature throws at them, whether that's drought, poor soil, or neglect. The key is getting them established properly in the first place, and then letting their natural survival instincts take over. Think about wild plants for a moment. Nobody waters them, nobody fertilizes them, nobody prunes them, and yet they come back year after year, thriving in conditions that would kill most of our pampered garden plants. What we're doing is bringing that same resilience into our food gardens. We're choosing plants that have those wild survival traits, but also happen to produce something delicious that we can eat. The first thing you need to understand is that this approach is all about the establishment phase. You can't just throw a plant in the ground and walk away from day one. Even the toughest, most drought-resistant plants need some help getting started. During that first growing season, maybe two if you're dealing with trees or larger shrubs, you're going to need to give them some attention. Water them regularly, make sure they're getting established, help them develop those deep root systems that will eventually let them fend for themselves. I like to think of it as an investment. You're putting in the work now so you can kick back and enjoy the rewards for years, sometimes decades to come. Once these plants are established, and I mean truly established with roots that go deep into the soil, they become incredibly self-sufficient. Now let's talk about which plants actually fit this description, because that's what you really want to know, right? Not every food plant is going to work for this approach. Your typical tomatoes, lettuce, or cucumbers. Forget about it. Those are annuals that need constant attention, regular watering, and they die at the end of the season anyway. What we're looking for are perennials, plants that come back year after year without replanting. At the top of my list are fruit trees and bushes, things like figs, mulberries, persimmons, and certain apple varieties, especially if you choose ones that are native or well adapted to your specific climate. Figs are absolutely incredible for this. Once established, they can handle serious drought. They don't need much pruning, and they produce an abundance of fruit. I've got a friend named Oliver who has a fig tree in his backyard that he literally ignores for 11 months of the year. Every August he goes out there and picks buckets of figs. That's it. That's his entire care routine. Berries are another fantastic option. I'm talking about things like blackberries, raspberries, and especially native varieties that grow wild in your area. If you've ever gone hiking and found wild blackberries growing on the side of a trail, you've seen exactly what I'm talking about. Nobody planted those, nobody waters them, and they're absolutely loaded with fruit every summer. You can bring that same energy into your garden. The The trick with berries is choosing the right varieties. Some cultivated varieties have been bred to be productive but dependent on care. Look for heritage varieties or wild types that are known for their toughness. Blackberries in particular can be almost aggressive in how well they grow. In fact, in some places they're considered invasive because they grow so well without any help. Channel that aggressiveness into free food for your family. Asparagus is a vegetable that fits this category perfectly, and it's one of my absolute favorites. If this guide has helped you, write 1 in the comments, and if not, write 0. This way, I'll know which tips are most useful for your garden. Now back to asparagus. Once you establish an asparagus bed, it can produce for 20, 30, even 50 years without replanting. The first couple of years, you need to be patient and let it establish. But after that, it's just about harvesting those delicious spears every spring. You don't need to water it, you don't need to fertilize it if you've prepared the bed properly, and it just keeps coming back. I planted an asparagus bed 5 years ago. And every April, like clockwork, those beautiful green spears start popping up. I harvest for about 6 weeks, then I let the plants fern out and do their thing for the rest of the year. 0 maintenance, maximum reward. Herbs are another category that deserves serious attention if you're building a low-maintenance food garden. Not all herbs fit the bill, but several do. Rosemary is probably the champion here, especially if you live in a climate where it's hardy. It's technically a woody shrub, and once established, it's nearly indestructible. It laughs at drought, it doesn't care about poor soil, and you can harvest from it year-round. I've seen rosemary plants that are decades old, massive bushes that produce more than any family could possibly use. Thyme is similar, especially creeping varieties. It forms these beautiful mats that spread over time, it handles drought brilliantly, and you can snip pieces whenever you need them for cooking. Oregano, sage, and certain mints also fall into this category, though be warned that mint can become invasive if you're not careful. But if you've got a spot where you want something tough that spreads and produces useful leaves, mint might be your answer. Let me tell you about someone I know named Rose who took this concept and ran with it in the most creative way. She lives in a hot, dry climate where water is expensive and summers are brutal. Traditional vegetable gardening was costing her a fortune in water bills and constant effort. So she decided to convert her entire yard into what she calls a food forest, using only plants that could handle neglect. She planted pomegranate trees, prickly pear cactus, jujube trees, and Mediterranean herbs. She spent 1 summer getting everything established, watering regularly and mulching heavily. After that first year, she stopped watering entirely. Now, 5 years later, her yard produces an incredible amount of food. The pomegranates drop fruit in the fall. The prickly pear produces edible pads and fruit. The jujubes are like little dates. And the herbs are always there when she needs them. Her water bill dropped dramatically, and she spends her time harvesting and preserving instead of watering and weeding. Soil preparation is absolutely critical if you want this approach to work. You can't just dig a hole and expect miracles. The better you prepare the soil during planting, the better your plants will establish, and the less care they'll need long term. What you're aiming for is soil that holds moisture deep down where roots can access it, but also drains well enough that roots don't rot. The magic ingredient here is organic matter. Compost, well-rotted manure, leaf mold, whatever you can get your hands on. Mix it generously into your planting holes and the surrounding soil. This organic matter acts like a sponge, holding water during dry spells and improving soil structure so roots can penetrate deeply. Deep roots are the secret to drought tolerance. A plant with roots that go down 3 feet can access moisture that surface roots will never find. Mulching is the other half of this equation, and honestly, if I could give you only one piece of advice for low-maintenance food gardening, it would be to mulch heavily. I'm talking about a layer of organic mulch at least 4 to 6 inches thick around all your plants. This could be wood chips, straw, leaves, grass clippings, whatever you have available. Mulch does several incredible things simultaneously. It prevents water from evaporating from the soil surface, which means whatever rain or irrigation your plants get stays in the ground longer. It suppresses weeds, which means less competition for your food plants and less work for you. It moderates soil temperature, keeping roots cooler in summer and warmer in winter. And as it breaks down over time, it adds organic matter back into the soil. improving fertility and structure. I've seen gardens that went from needing water every other day to barely needing water at all, just from adding a thick layer of mulch. Climate matching is something we need to talk about seriously because this is where a lot of people go wrong. You cannot force a plant that evolved in a wet climate to thrive without water in a dry climate, no matter how tough it is. The key to success is choosing plants that are naturally adapted to your specific conditions. If you live somewhere with hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters, you want plants from Mediterranean climates. Think olives, figs, pomegranates, grapes, lavender, rosemary. These plants are genetically programmed to handle summer drought because that's what they evolved with. If you live somewhere with cold winters and moderate rainfall year-round, you're looking at different plants entirely. Apples, pears, berries, asparagus, rhubarb, these are your friends. The absolute best thing you can do is look at what grows wild in your area and use that as your guide. There's this concept in permaculture called plant guilds that can really help you build a food garden that takes care of itself. The idea is that you plant multiple species together that support each other in different ways, kind of like building a little ecosystem. A classic example is planting nitrogen-fixing plants near your fruit trees. Nitrogen fixers like clover, lupines, or even certain shrubs can pull nitrogen from the air and make it available in the soil, essentially fertilizing your fruit trees for free. You can also plant deep-rooted plants next to shallow-rooted ones so they're not competing for the same resources. Or plant species that attract beneficial insects near your food plants so you've got natural pest control happening without any effort from you. When you design your garden as an ecosystem instead of just a collection of individual plants, it becomes way more resilient and self-maintaining. I want to share another story that really illustrates the power of choosing the right plants. There's this guy I met named Lucas who bought a property that had basically been abandoned for a decade. The previous owners had planted a bunch of fruit trees and then just left. When Lucas moved in, he expected to find dead trees, or at least struggling ones. Instead, he found apple trees, pear trees and plum trees that had been surviving completely on their own for 10 years. No watering, no pruning, no pest control, nothing. Sure, the fruit wasn't perfect, and the trees were a bit wild-looking, but they were alive and producing. With just a little bit of pruning and some mulch, Lucas brought those trees back to abundant production. But the point is, they survived a decade of total neglect. That's the kind of resilience we're trying to build into our gardens from the start. Let's talk about some more specific plant recommendations, because I want to give you a diverse toolkit to work with. Nut trees are fantastic for this approach, though they do require patience because they take years to start producing. But once they're established, they're incredibly low maintenance and can produce for generations. Chestnuts, hazelnuts, and certain types of oaks that produce edible acorns are all worth considering. Hazelnuts in particular are pretty easy to grow and start producing within a few years. They're also nitrogen fixers in some cases, which means they improve your soil while they grow. Nut trees in general have deep root systems, so once established they can access groundwater that other plants can't reach. Perennial vegetables beyond asparagus deserve mention too. Rhubarb is an absolute champion of neglect. Plant it once in a good spot with decent soil and it will produce those tart stalks every spring for decades. It doesn't need watering once established, it doesn't need fertilizing, and it can handle cold winters and hot summers with equal ease. Jerusalem artichokes, also called sunchokes, are another interesting option. They're related to sunflowers and produce edible tubers underground. They can become invasive if you're not careful, but if you've got a spot where you want something productive that requires zero care, they'll deliver. You harvest the tubers in fall and winter, and any you leave in the ground will grow into next year's crop. It's a perpetual cycle with no replanting needed. Grapes are worth a serious look if you've got space and the right climate. Once a grapevine is established, it can be incredibly drought-tolerant and productive. Old grapevines can live for 100 years or more, producing fruit every single season. Now, grapes do benefit from some pruning if you want maximum production, but I've seen completely unpruned, neglected grapevines still producing pounds and pounds of fruit. They're not as productive as properly cared for vines, but they still deliver without much effort. In hot, dry climates, grapes are especially well suited because that's what they evolved for. Mediterranean and Middle Eastern grapes have been surviving hot, dry summers for thousands of years. Fruit trees in general need some discussion about varieties because not all fruit trees are created equal when it comes to toughness and self-sufficiency. Modern commercial varieties have often been bred for maximum production and perfect fruit, but that usually comes at the cost of resilience. They need spraying, regular fertilizing, careful pruning, and consistent watering. But if you go back to heritage varieties or regional varieties that people have been growing for generations in your area, you often find much tougher trees. These older varieties might not produce fruit that looks as perfect or yields quite as much, but they'll do it year after year with minimal help from you. Look for varieties described as heirloom, heritage, or that are known to grow in your region historically. There's also something to be said for letting volunteer plants become part of your food garden. I know this sounds a bit unconventional, but hear me out. In my garden, I've got a cherry tomato plant that has been reseeding itself for 3 years now. Every spring, seedlings pop up in various spots, and I just let the ones in good locations grow. I don't plant them, I don't really water them beyond what they get from rain, and they produce tons of cherry tomatoes every summer. They're way tougher than any transplants I've ever bought because they're essentially weeds at this point, selected for survival in my specific conditions. The same thing can happen with herbs, certain squashes, and even things like potatoes if you leave some in the ground. Nature is really good at propagating plants when we get out of the way. Water harvesting and passive irrigation can take your low-maintenance garden to the next level. Even if you're aiming for plants that don't need regular watering, you can set up your landscape to capture and direct water to them when it does rain. This is about working smarter, not harder. Simple techniques like digging shallow swales, which are basically level ditches that catch and hold rainwater, can make a huge difference. When it rains, instead of that water running off your property, it soaks into your swales and waters your plants deeply. You can also direct downspouts from your roof toward planting areas. That way, every time it rains, your plants get a good drink without you lifting a finger. One good soaking from a rainstorm, especially if you've captured and directed the water well, can sustain plants for weeks. Companion planting with native plants is another strategy that often gets overlooked. Native plants are by definition adapted to survive in your area without help. If you interplant your food crops with natives, you're creating a more resilient ecosystem overall. Native plants support local pollinators and beneficial insects, which helps with pest control and pollination of your food plants. They also can provide microclimates and wind protection. For example, planting native shrubs around your fruit trees can create shade that reduces water stress and provides habitat for birds that eat pest insects. You're building a food-producing ecosystem that's much more stable and self-regulating than a monoculture garden. Timing your planting is crucial for success with low-maintenance food plants. In most climates, fall is actually the best time to plant perennials and trees. When you plant in fall, the plant has the entire cool, moist season to develop roots before facing the stress of summer heat. This gives it a huge head start. Spring planting can work, but you're immediately asking the plant to deal with growing leaves and flowers while also trying to establish roots, and then summer hits before it's really ready. Fall-planted trees and perennials almost always establish better and need less supplemental watering than spring-planted ones. There are exceptions depending on your specific climate, but this is a general rule that serves most gardeners well. Let me tell you about a concept that changed how I think about garden productivity. It's called stacking functions, and it's particularly useful for low-maintenance gardens. The idea is that every element in your garden should serve multiple purposes. A fruit tree isn't just producing fruit. It's also providing shade, which can create a microclimate underneath where you can grow shade-loving herbs or vegetables. It's dropping leaves that become mulch and soil fertility. It's providing habitat for beneficial insects and birds. If you choose the right species, it might also be fixing nitrogen or have edible flowers or medicinal bark. When you start thinking this way, every plant you add is contributing to the system in multiple ways, and the whole garden becomes more productive and self-sustaining. Propagation is something worth learning if you're serious about building a low-maintenance food garden. Many of the plants we've talked about can be propagated easily from cuttings, divisions, or layering. This means you can start with 1 or 2 plants and multiply them over time without spending more money. Fig trees are incredibly easy to propagate from cuttings. You literally just cut a branch, stick it in the ground, keep it moist for a few weeks, and it grows. Blackberries and raspberries naturally propagate themselves by sending out runners or tip rooting. You can dig up these new plants and move them to expand your berry patch. Herbs like rosemary, thyme, and oregano all root readily from cuttings. Learning these simple propagation techniques means you can fill your garden with productive plants at minimal cost. Diversity is your friend when building a resilient food garden. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, as they say. If you plant 10 different types of food plants and 2 of them fail in a particular year due to weather or pests, you've still got 8 that are producing. If you only planted 2 types and 1 fails, that's half your harvest gone. The more diversity you have, the more stable your overall production becomes. Different plants also have different harvest times, which means you're getting food throughout the growing season rather than all at once. This makes your garden more useful and less overwhelming. A diverse garden also supports a more diverse ecosystem, which generally means better pest control and pollination without your intervention. Pest and disease management in a low-maintenance garden is really about prevention and acceptance rather than active control. You're not going to spray pesticides or fungicides in a garden you're trying to keep hands off. Instead, you're relying on plant health and ecosystem balance. Healthy plants with deep roots and good nutrition are naturally more resistant to pests and diseases. A diverse garden with lots of flowering plants attracts beneficial insects that prey on pest species. You're also accepting that some damage is okay. Not every fruit needs to be perfect. If the birds eat some of your berries, you'll still have plenty left. This mindset shift is important. In conventional gardening, we're taught to fight for perfection and zero pest damage. In low-maintenance gardening, we're aiming for good enough and letting nature sort out most problems on its own. One of my favourite plants for a truly hands-off food garden is the perennial kale, also called tree kale or tree collards. This plant is absolutely remarkable. It's a perennial version of kale that grows into a shrub-like plant that can produce edible leaves year-round in mild climates. You can harvest leaves continuously without harming the plant, and it doesn't need replanting every year like regular kale. It's also incredibly tough once established and can handle neglect that would kill most vegetable plants. You propagate it from cuttings, so once you have one plant, you can create as many more as you want for free. If you've got the climate for it, this is one of those plants that gives you fresh greens constantly with almost no effort. Mushrooms are another fascinating addition to a low-maintenance food garden. Though they're a bit different from what we've been discussing. Certain mushrooms, particularly oyster mushrooms and wine cap mushrooms, can be established in mulch or on logs and will then fruit repeatedly over several years, with no care needed. You inoculate logs or mulch beds with mushroom spawn, and then you just wait. When conditions are right, usually after rain in spring and fall, mushrooms will pop up and you can harvest them. Then they disappear back underground and wait for the next favourable conditions. It's almost magical, and it adds another dimension to your food production with very little space or effort required. Winecap mushrooms in particular will spread through mulch beds, actually helping to break down the mulch while producing flushes of edible mushrooms. I want to talk about realistic expectations because I think that's important. When I say these plants survive without watering or care, I mean once they're fully established and growing in appropriate conditions. Even the toughest plants will produce more and higher quality food if they get some occasional attention. A little water during an extreme drought, maybe some compost or mulch added once a year, occasional harvesting that actually encourages more production, these small interventions can significantly boost your yields. But the beautiful thing is, you don't have to do these things. If you go on vacation for a month or have a busy period where you can't get to the garden, these plants will be fine. They won't die, and they'll still produce. That's the key difference from conventional vegetables that will shrivel and die if you miss a few waterings. There's also something deeply satisfying and almost spiritual about this approach to gardening. You're working with natural systems instead of fighting against them. You're choosing plants that want to grow in your conditions rather than forcing plants to survive where they don't belong. You're building soil fertility through natural cycles instead of dumping synthetic fertilizers. You're creating habitat for wildlife while also feeding yourself. It feels more like collaboration with nature than domination of it. And honestly, it's just less stressful. Gardening should be enjoyable, not a chore that hangs over your head every day. When you build a low-maintenance food garden, you get all the rewards with a fraction of the work. Climate change is making this approach more relevant than ever. As weather becomes more unpredictable, with longer droughts interspersed with heavy rains, plants that can handle variability and extremes become increasingly valuable. The techniques we've discussed, deep roots, heavy mulching, appropriate plant selection, these are all strategies that help plants handle whatever weather comes their way. A garden full of resilient perennials is much better equipped to survive a changing climate than annual vegetables that need perfect conditions every year. By building your food garden around tough, adapted plants now, you're future-proofing your food security. If you're starting from scratch and feeling overwhelmed, here's my advice. Start small. Pick 3 or 4 plants from the categories we've discussed that seem well suited to your climate and that produce food you actually want to eat. Maybe a fig tree, a berry patch, some asparagus, and a few herbs. Plant them properly, take care of them for that first year to get them established, and then start backing off on the care. See what happens. Learn from those plants. Once you've got those thriving with minimal input, add a few more. Over several years, you can build up a diverse food garden that produces abundantly without demanding constant attention. This incremental approach is less overwhelming and lets you learn as you go. Finding local sources for adapted plants can make a huge difference. Big box stores often carry plants that are bred for mass production and wide appeal, not necessarily for toughness in your specific area. Look for local nurseries, especially ones that specialize in native plants or heritage varieties. Talk to experienced gardeners in your area about what grows well for them with minimal care. Join local gardening groups or online forums focused on your region. These connections can give you access to plant varieties that are proven performers in your specific conditions. You might even find people willing to share cuttings or divisions from their own successful low-maintenance plants. As we wrap up this conversation, I want to emphasize that building a low-maintenance food garden is absolutely achievable for anyone willing to think a little differently about gardening. It requires some planning and some patience during the establishment phase, but the long-term rewards are tremendous. Imagine walking out into your yard in a few years and harvesting fresh fruit, vegetables, and herbs from plants that you barely have to think about. That's not a fantasy. That's the reality I'm living, and it's a reality you can create for yourself with the right approach. Choose plants adapted to your climate, prepare your soil well, mulch heavily, and then trust the plants to do what they've evolved to do, which is survive and produce. You'll be amazed at what's possible when you work with nature instead of against it. And I promise you'll never look at gardening the same way again.